The iron gate stood like a sentinel against the dying light, its rust-stained bars casting long shadows across the mountain path. Beyond it, smoke curled from a stone chimney, promising warmth that seemed as distant as the stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Cheryl Jimenez pressed her face against the cold metal, her breath forming ghostly clouds in the bitter air. 3 days without food had left her hollow, her body trembling, not just from the mountain cold, but from the gnawing emptiness that had become her constant companion. Her fingers, white with cold and streaked with dirt, traced the intricate ironwork as she searched for some weakness, some gap that might allow her passage. The gate was locked, secured with a heavy chain that spoke of a man who valued his solitude above all else. She had heard whispers in the valley below about the hermit who lived on this mountain, stories that painted him as either a guardian angel or a dangerous recluse, depending on who told the tale. Desperation had driven her here, up the winding path that seemed to climb toward heaven itself, seeking the one person who might help her when the rest of the world had turned its back. The wind picked up, sending her long, dark hair whipping across her face as she stumbled backward from the gate. Her legs, weak from hunger and exhaustion, buckled beneath her. She fell hard onto the rocky ground, the impact sending shockwaves through her already battered body. For a moment, she simply lay there, staring up at the first stars appearing in the purple sky. The irony was not lost on her that she might die here, at the very threshold of potential salvation, too weak to call out, too proud to beg, even if someone could hear her. The path behind her stretched down into darkness, marking the journey that had brought her to this desperate moment. 3 months ago, she had been Cheryl Jimenez, school teacher in the small town of Cedar Falls, respected and self-sufficient. She had lived in the modest house her grandmother had left her, tending a small garden and finding joy in the simple rhythms of mountain life. Then the sickness came, sweeping through the valley like a plague, taking her savings as surely as it had taken her health. The medical bills mounted faster than snow in a blizzard, and when the bank came calling, she discovered that respect and good intentions were poor currency against the cold mathematics of debt. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The memory of that final morning still burned in her chest, standing in the doorway of what had been her home, watching strangers load her possessions onto a wagon while the banker, Gregory Reyes, stood nearby with papers that sealed her fate. He had been apologetic but firm, his words about market conditions and unfortunate circumstances ringing hollow against the reality of her homelessness. She had walked away with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of bitter understanding about how quickly security could crumble. The weeks that followed had been a harsh education in survival. She had sought work in neighboring towns, but whispers of her financial ruin preceded her like a shadow. Doors that might have opened to Cheryl the schoolteacher remained firmly closed to Cheryl the debtor. She had slept in barns when farmers took pity on her, under bridges when they did not. The gnawing in her stomach had become a familiar companion, and she had learned to ignore the way her clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame. It was in the town of Millfield that she first heard the name Noah Castillo spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for legends. The old woman at the general store, Nancy Powell, had been kind enough to let her sweep the floors in exchange for a crust of bread, and had spoken of the mountain man with a mixture of admiration and wariness. He lived alone, Nancy had explained, in a cabin high up on Eagle Peak, a man who had turned his back on civilization after some tragedy that no one quite understood. Some said he was a former soldier. Others claimed he had been a doctor who had lost too many patients. What everyone agreed on was that he was dangerous to cross but generous to those he deemed worthy of help. The stories painted a picture of a man who existed outside the normal rules of society, answerable to no one but his own moral code. Travelers spoke of finding supplies left at strategic points along mountain trails during harsh winters, always unsigned but bearing the mark of someone who understood survival. Others told of strangers who had stumbled into his territory, injured or lost, only to wake up days later in the valley below with their wounds tended and their packs filled with provisions. But there were darker tales too, warnings about what happened to those who came to his mountain with ill intent or tried to take advantage of his generosity. Nancy had studied Cheryl with eyes that had seen too much of life's cruelty, then pressed a small piece of paper into her hand. On it was drawn a rough map showing the path up Eagle Peak, marked with warnings about dangerous passages and notes about where to find shelter if the weather turned. At the bottom, in Nancy's careful script, were the words, "He helps those who truly need it, but only if they prove they deserve it." The climb had taken her 2 days, her weakened state making every step a battle against gravity and despair. She had rationed the last of her meager supplies, a handful of berries and a crust of bread that Nancy had slipped into her pocket, making them last as long as possible. The path was treacherous, winding through dense forest and across exposed rock faces that left her dizzy with vertigo. More than once she had considered turning back, but the knowledge that there was nothing waiting for her in the valley below kept her moving forward. On the second day, the weather had turned against her. Storm clouds gathered with ominous speed, and soon she was struggling through a downpour that turned the mountain path into a river of mud and loose stones. Her thin coat provided little protection against the driving rain, and by the time she reached the final approach to Noah Castillo's property, she was soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. The sight of the iron gate through the trees had filled her with a desperate hope that now seemed cruelly misplaced. Now, lying on the cold ground with darkness gathering around her, Cheryl felt the last of her strength ebbing away. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done. Her clothes clung to her body like a second skin of ice, and she could no longer feel her fingers or toes. The rational part of her mind, the part that had once planned lessons and balanced budgets, told her that she needed to find shelter soon or risk freezing to death on this mountainside. But her body seemed to have reached the end of its endurance, every muscle aching with the deep fatigue that comes from too many days of too little food and too much hardship. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the energy to call out, to make some noise that might alert the mysterious Noah Castillo to her presence. But her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, lost in the vast silence of the mountain night. The irony struck her again, sharper this time. She had climbed all this way, endured so much, only to fail at the final moment because she lacked the strength to announce herself. The stars above seemed to mock her with their distant brightness, beautiful and unreachable. She thought of her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents died, who had taught her that dignity was something no one could take away as long as you held on to it yourself. What would the old woman think of her now, collapsed at a stranger's gate like a beggar? But even as the thought brought shame, it also brought a flicker of defiance. Her grandmother had also taught her that there was no shame in asking for help when you truly needed it. That pride was a luxury that could sometimes cost more than a person could afford to pay. With tremendous effort, Cheryl rolled onto her side and began to crawl toward the gate. Her knees scraped against the rough stones and her palms left bloody prints on the ground. But she forced herself forward. If she was going to die here, she would not do so lying passive in the dirt. She would make one last attempt to reach the man who might be her salvation, even if it killed her in the trying. The gate loomed above her as she pressed her face against the cold iron bars. Through them, she could see a narrow path leading up to a cabin that glowed with warm yellow light. Smoke continued to rise from the chimney, and she could almost imagine the heat radiating from whatever fire burned within. It seemed like a vision of paradise, so close she could almost touch it, yet separated from her by barriers that might as well have been mountains themselves. She tried to call out again, putting every ounce of remaining strength into her voice. This time, the sound that emerged was stronger, a desperate plea that echoed off the surrounding rocks and trees. The effort left her gasping, her vision blurring at the edges, but she had managed to produce something that might carry beyond the confines of her immediate surroundings. She pressed her ear to the gate, straining to hear any response, any sign that her cry had been heard. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant call of a night bird. Cheryl felt her heart sinking as the seconds passed without any indication that help was coming. Perhaps Noah Castillo was not home, or perhaps he had heard her but chosen not to respond. The stories had mentioned that he was selective about whom he helped, and maybe a desperate woman collapsed at his gate did not meet his standards for worthy assistance. Just as despair began to reclaim her completely, she heard something that made her pulse quicken. Footsteps, heavy, measured, approaching from the direction of the cabin. They grew louder as they drew nearer, accompanied by the soft jingle of keys and the scrape of boots on stone. Cheryl struggled to lift her head, to present herself as something more than a pathetic heap of misery, but her body refused to cooperate. She remained pressed against the gate, her face turned toward the approaching figure, hoping that her eyes would convey what her voice could not. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the gate, and Cheryl found herself staring up at a man who seemed to have stepped out of the mountain itself. Noah Castillo was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with premature silver, and his face marked by lines that spoke of years spent facing harsh weather and harder choices. His eyes, when they met hers through the iron bars, were the deep brown of rich earth, and in them she saw a wariness that had been earned through experience. He wore simple clothes, a heavy wool shirt and sturdy pants, but they were clean and well-maintained, speaking of a man who took care of himself even in isolation. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, predator and prey, savior and supplicant, two souls separated by iron and circumstance. Cheryl tried to read his expression, to find some clue about what he was thinking, but his face remained carefully neutral. She had heard that mountain men were skilled at hiding their thoughts, that survival often depended on revealing nothing to potential threats, and she wondered if that was what she represented to him now. Then Noah spoke, his voice deep and rough from disuse but not unkind. "You're trespassing on private property." The words were a statement of fact rather than an accusation, delivered without heat but with an authority that brooked no argument. "This is posted land. No hunting, no camping, no soliciting." Cheryl tried to respond, to explain her situation and plead her case, but the words came out as little more than a croak. Her throat was raw from a thirst and cold, and the effort of calling out earlier had left her voice nearly gone. She could only lie there looking up at him with eyes that she hoped conveyed her desperation and need. Noah studied her for another moment, his gaze taking in her bedraggled appearance, her obvious exhaustion, and the way she trembled against the cold ground. When he spoke again, his tone had softened slightly, though it remained cautious. "How long since you've eaten?" The question was practical, clinical, the kind a doctor might ask when assessing a patient's condition. 3 days, Cheryl managed to whisper, the words barely audible even in the mountain stillness. "Maybe 4. I've lost track." Something shifted in Noah's expression at her admission, a flicker of what might have been compassion or recognition. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a ring of keys, selecting one with the practiced ease of long familiarity. The sound of the lock turning seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, followed by the creak of hinges as the gate swung open. But instead of immediately helping her to her feet, Noah remained standing, studying her with an intensity that made Cheryl feel exposed and vulnerable. She realized that this was a test of some kind, that her next actions would determine whether she found sanctuary or was turned away to face the mountain night alone. The stories about Noah Castillo had emphasized his selectiveness, his ability to judge character quickly and accurately. She was being evaluated, and her life might depend on passing whatever criteria he used to separate the worthy from the unworthy. With effort that felt like lifting mountains, Cheryl pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. Her arms shook with the strain, and black spots danced at the edges of her vision, but she forced herself to meet Noah's gaze directly. Pride might be a luxury she could not afford, but dignity was something else entirely. She would not grovel, would not beg, even though every instinct screamed at her to do whatever was necessary to secure his help. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I can work. I can earn whatever help you might give me." The words came out steadier than she had expected, carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "I was a school teacher before everything fell apart. I can read, write, do figures. I'm not afraid of hard work." Noah's expression remained unreadable, but she thought she detected a slight nod, as if her response had met with his approval. He stepped closer, moving with the careful deliberation of a man accustomed to dangerous terrain, both literal and metaphorical. When he reached down to help her to her feet, his grip was strong and steady, the calloused hands of someone who worked with them daily. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice matter-of-fact, as he assessed her condition with the eye of someone experienced in dealing with people pushed to their limits. Cheryl tested her weight on unsteady legs, swaying slightly but managing to remain upright with his support. "I think so," she said, though even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I just need to get warm, get some food in me. I'll be fine." Noah made a sound that might have been agreement or skepticism, but he did not argue. Instead, he adjusted his grip to better support her weight and began walking slowly toward the cabin, matching his pace to her faltering steps. The path was rougher than it had appeared from the gate, marked with roots and stones that threatened to trip her weakened legs. But Noah's steady presence kept her upright. As they approached the cabin, Cheryl could see that it was larger than she had initially thought, built with the solid craftsmanship of someone who understood mountain weather and the importance of strong shelter. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and warm light spilled from windows that glowed like beacons in the darkness. It looked like home in a way that made her chest ache with longing for the security she had lost. But even as relief flooded through her at the prospect of warmth and shelter, a new worry began to gnaw at her thoughts. She was about to enter the domain of a man she knew only through stories, placing herself completely at his mercy. The tales she had heard painted him as honorable but unpredictable, generous but demanding. She had no idea what he might expect in return for his help, or whether she would be able to meet his expectations in her current weakened state. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the interior that seemed to promise everything she had been dreaming of during her long, cold climb up the mountain. But as Noah paused with his hand on the door frame, she sensed that crossing this threshold would change everything. There would be no going back to the person she had been before, no return to the simple certainties of her former life. Whatever lay ahead would be built on the foundation of this moment, this choice to trust a stranger with her life. Noah turned to look at her one final time before opening the door fully, his dark eyes searching her face as if seeking confirmation that she understood the significance of what was happening. "Once you cross this threshold," he said quietly, his words carrying a weight that went beyond their simple meaning, "there's no pretending things are the way they used to be. You'll be under my protection, but that comes with responsibilities. Are you prepared for that?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Cheryl realized that her answer would determine not just whether she survived the night, but what kind of person she would become in the days and weeks to come. Behind her lay the path down the mountain, leading back to a world that had already rejected her. Ahead lay the unknown, represented by this enigmatic man and his mountain sanctuary. The choice seemed simple, but she sensed that the consequences would be anything but. As she opened her mouth to respond, a sound from the darkness beyond the cabin made them both freeze. It was distant but unmistakable. The baying of hounds carried on the night wind like a promise of pursuit. Noah's expression hardened instantly, his body tensing as he scanned the tree line with the alertness of a man who had faced danger before. The peaceful moment shattered like glass, replaced by an urgency that made Cheryl's heart race with fresh fear. "They found the trail," Noah said grimly, his voice carrying a certainty that chilled her more than the mountain air. "We need to get inside. Now!" The sound of approaching hounds sent ice through Cheryl's veins as Noah's strong hand gripped her arm, pulling her across the threshold with an urgency that brooked no hesitation. The cabin door slammed shut behind them with finality that seemed to echo through the mountains themselves. In the sudden warmth of the interior, she caught a glimpse of rough-hewn furniture, shelves lined with books and supplies, and a stone fireplace where flames danced with welcoming light. But there was no time to appreciate the sanctuary she had fought so hard to reach. Noah moved with the fluid efficiency of a man who had faced danger before, his hands already reaching for a heavy wooden bar that he dropped across the door without a solid thud. The gesture spoke of preparation, of a man who had anticipated this moment and planned for it. He crossed to the window, peering through a gap in the heavy curtains at the darkness beyond, his body tense with alertness. "How many are there?" Cheryl whispered, though she was not sure why she kept her voice low. The hounds were still distant, their baying carried on the mountain wind like a promise of violence to come. "Hard to say," Noah replied, his voice grim as he continued his surveillance. "But they wouldn't come up here at night unless they were serious about finding something. Or someone." He turned from the window to study her face, his dark eyes searching for answers to questions he had not yet asked aloud. You want to tell me what you've done to earn that kind of attention? The accusation in his tone stung, but Cheryl forced herself to meet his gaze directly. I haven't done anything, she said, her voice gaining strength despite her exhaustion. Unless you count losing everything I owned and being forced to beg for help as a crime. Noah's expression remained skeptical, but something in her voice seemed to give him pause. He moved away from the window, crossing to a cabinet where he retrieved a rifle with the practiced ease of long familiarity. The weapon was well maintained, its metal gleaming in the firelight, and he handled it with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it effectively. People don't send hunting parties up Eagle Peak for deaders, he said, checking the rifle's action with quick, efficient movements. This kind of pursuit costs money, requires planning. Someone wants you found badly enough to risk men and dogs on a mountain at night. The implications of his words settled over Cheryl like a cold shroud. She had assumed that her flight from Cedar Falls had gone unnoticed, that she was just another casualty of economic hardship who had slipped through the cracks of society. But if Noah was right, if someone had indeed organized a pursuit, then there were forces at work that she did not understand. I don't know why anyone would come after me, she said, sinking into a chair near the fireplace as the warmth began to penetrate her chilled bones. I lost my house to the bank, lost my job when the school closed. There's nothing left for anyone to take. Noah set the rifle within easy reach and moved to the stove, where he began preparing something that smelled like heaven to Cheryl's empty stomach. Coffee, she realized, and something that might have been soup or stew. The domestic actions seemed at odds with the tension that filled the cabin, but she supposed that mountain men learned to maintain normal routines even in the face of danger. Tell me about the banker, Noah said without turning around. Gregory Reyes, wasn't it? What kind of man is he? The question surprised her both for its specificity and for the way Noah had remembered the name from her earlier recounting. How did you know about Gregory? She asked, though even as the words left her mouth, she realized that news traveled quickly in small mountain communities. Word gets around, Noah replied, ladling soup into a bowl and setting it before her on the rough wooden table. Especially when it involves someone like Reyes. He's got a reputation for being thorough in his collections. Cheryl accepted the soup gratefully, the warmth of the bowl seeping through her frozen fingers like a benediction. The first spoonful sent heat racing through her body, and she had to force herself to eat slowly despite the gnawing hunger that demanded she devour everything in sight. He seemed decent enough when he foreclosed on my house, she said between careful spoonfuls. Apologetic even, said it was just business, nothing personal. Noah made a sound that might have been bitter laughter. Nothing personal, he repeated, settling into the chair across from her. That's what they always say when they're destroying someone's life for profit. But Gregory Reyes doesn't strike me as the type to let loose ends dangle. If he foreclosed on your property, he'd want to make sure there were no complications, no one who might cause trouble later. The soup was thick with vegetables and meat, more nourishing than anything Cheryl had tasted in weeks. But Noah's words cast a shadow over the simple pleasure of eating, introducing possibilities that she had not considered. What kind of complications could I cause, she asked. I don't have any legal recourse, no money for lawyers or appeals. Maybe not, Noah agreed, but you know things. You lived in that house, worked in that community. You might have seen or heard something that could prove embarrassing if it came to light. The baying of the hounds grew closer and Noah rose from his chair to check the window again. His movements were controlled, economical, but Cheryl could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from the rifle. Whatever was coming up the mountain path, he was prepared to meet it with force if necessary. There's something else, Cheryl said, the memory surfacing like a bubble rising through dark water. The night before the foreclosure, I saw Gregory meeting with someone behind the bank. It was late after midnight, and I was walking home from sitting with old Mrs. Patterson while she was sick. They were arguing about something, and I heard Gregory mention my grandmother's property specifically. Noah turned from the window, his attention fully focused on her now. What exactly did you hear? Cheryl closed her eyes, trying to recall the details of that strange encounter. At the time, she had been too exhausted and preoccupied with her own troubles to pay much attention to what had seemed like a routine business discussion. But now, with the sound of pursuit growing ever closer, every detail took on new significance. The other man was angry about something, she said slowly. He kept saying that Gregory was supposed to handle things quietly, that there couldn't be any witnesses or loose ends. Gregory kept insisting that everything was under control, that the foreclosure would proceed as planned and no one would ask questions. "Did you recognize the other man?" Noah asked, his voice sharp with interest. "I thought he looked familiar, but it was dark and I was tired. I assumed he was just another businessman from one of the neighboring towns." She paused, the soup forgotten as the memory crystallized with disturbing clarity. "But now that I think about it, he had an expensive coat, city clothes, not the kind of person you'd expect to see in Cedar Falls at that hour." The implications hung between them like smoke from the fireplace. If Cheryl had inadvertently witnessed something that was supposed to remain secret, if her presence that night had been noted and remembered, then her subsequent disappearance might indeed have prompted someone to organize a search. But the question remained, what had she seen that was worth sending armed men up a mountain to find her? Noah moved to another cabinet, retrieving supplies with the efficiency of a man who had planned for various contingencies. He set out ammunition, medical supplies, and what looked like emergency rations, arranging them with military precision on the table beside his rifle. The preparations spoke of experience with dangerous situations, and Cheryl wondered again about the stories that surrounded this enigmatic mountain man. "You said you were a soldier," she ventured, watching him work. "I said no such thing," Noah replied without looking up from his preparations. "People say a lot of things about me. Most of them are wrong." The correction was gentle but firm, and Cheryl realized that she had been making assumptions based on gossip and speculation. Whatever Noah Castillo's background, whatever had driven him to seek solitude on this mountain, he was not inclined to share those details with a stranger, even one he had chosen to shelter from the storm. The sound of the hounds was closer now, close enough that individual voices could be distinguished from the general baying. Noah counted them silently, his lips moving as he tracked each animal by its unique call. When he finished, his expression was grim. "6 dogs," he said, "which means at least 3 men, probably more. They're moving fast, which suggests they know exactly where they're going." He met her eyes across the cabin, and she saw something in his gaze that might have been sympathy. "I'm sorry, Cheryl, but they're not here by accident. Someone sent them specifically to find you." The words hit her like a physical blow, confirming fears that she had tried to suppress since the moment she heard the first distant howl. She was not just a homeless woman seeking shelter. She was a fugitive, whether she understood why or not. And by helping her, Noah had made himself a target as well. "I should leave," she said, starting to rise from her chair, despite the weakness in her legs. "I should go back down the mountain, turn myself in. I won't let you get hurt because of me." Noah's hand on her shoulder pressed her back into the chair, the gentle but irresistible force. "Too late for that," he said simply. "They've already seen you come here, already know I've taken you in. Leaving now would just make you an easy target and accomplish nothing." The truth of his words was undeniable, but it brought no comfort. Cheryl felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. This man had shown her kindness when the rest of the world had turned away, and now she had brought danger to his doorstep. The irony was bitter. In seeking sanctuary, she might have destroyed the very refuge that had offered her hope. "What do we do?" she asked, hating the helplessness in her voice but unable to suppress it. Noah moved to extinguish the oil lamps, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the glow from the fireplace. "We wait," he said, settling into a position where he could watch both the door and the window. "We listen, and if they try to force their way in, we make them regret it." The confidence in his voice was reassuring, but Cheryl could not shake the feeling that they were trapped, cornered animals, waiting for the hunters to close in. The cabin that had seemed like salvation now felt like a prison, its solid walls both protection and constraint. Outside, the night seemed to pulse with malevolent intent, every shadow potentially concealing an enemy. Minutes passed in tense silence, marked only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of pursuit drawing ever closer. Cheryl found herself straining to hear every nuance of the approaching threat, trying to glean information from the rhythm of the hounds and the occasional shout of their handlers. The men were organized, professional, moving with the coordination of a well-planned operation. Military, Noah said quietly as if reading her thoughts. Or law enforcement. These aren't bounty hunters or hired thugs. Someone with authority is behind this. The observation sent a chill through Cheryl that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. If official forces were involved, then her situation was far more serious than she had imagined. She was no longer just a debtor fleeing her creditors. She was someone that the government itself wanted to find. But what could she possibly have done to warrant such attention? The answer came to her with sickening clarity as another memory surfaced. This one from several weeks before the foreclosure. She had been cleaning out her grandmother's attic, sorting through decades of accumulated possessions, when she had discovered a metal box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside had been documents, old surveys, and property deeds that seemed to suggest her grandmother's land extended far beyond what Cheryl had believed she owned. At the time, she had been too overwhelmed by her financial crisis to pay much attention to what had seemed like historical curiosities. The papers were old, some dating back to the previous century, and she had assumed they were simply family records with no practical significance. But now, with armed men hunting her through the mountains, she wondered if those documents might have revealed something that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. "My grandmother's papers," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush of realization. "I found old property deeds in her house, surveys that showed the land boundaries differently than what the bank claimed. I didn't think much of it at the time, but what if they proved that the foreclosure was illegal?" Noah's attention sharpened like a blade. "Where are those papers now?" "Gone," Cheryl said, her heart sinking as she remembered. "They were in the house when the bank took it. I assumed they would just be thrown away with the rest of my things." "Or kept," Noah said grimly, "by people who understood their significance better than you did." He moved to the window again, peering through the curtains at the approaching torches that flickered between the trees like malevolent stars. "If those documents proved that your grandmother's land was more valuable than anyone realized, if they showed that the foreclosure was based on false information—" He did not need to finish the sentence. Cheryl understood the implications well enough. In a region where land was the foundation of all wealth, where mining rights and timber claims could make or break entire communities, proof that a foreclosure had been fraudulent could destroy reputations and cost fortunes. Men had killed for far less in these mountains. The sound of voices reached them now, carried on the night air with disturbing clarity. The pursuers were close enough that their words were becoming distinguishable from the general noise of their approach. Cheryl caught fragments of conversation, references to positions and search patterns that confirmed Noah's assessment of their military organization. "They're surrounding the cabin," Noah said, his voice calm despite the gravity of their situation. "Professional job. They'll try to take us alive if possible, but they're prepared for resistance." The casual way he discussed their tactical situations suggested that this was not his first experience with such circumstances. Cheryl wondered again about his background, about what had prepared him for moments like this. But there was no time for questions, no opportunity to satisfy her curiosity about the man who had become her unlikely protector. A voice called out from the darkness, amplified by a speaking trumpet that gave it an official, authoritative quality. "Noah Castillo, we know you're in there, and we know you have the woman with you. Send her out, and no one needs to get hurt." The demand hung in the air between them, a stark choice that reduced their complex situation to simple terms. Cheryl looked at Noah, expecting to see resignation or calculation in his eyes, some sign that he was weighing the costs and benefits of compliance. Instead, she saw only a cold determination that reminded her why the stories about him carried such weight in the valley below. "They can want a lot of things," he said quietly, checking his rifle one final time. "Doesn't mean they're going to get them." The response filled Cheryl with a complex mixture of gratitude and terror. She was grateful that he was not simply handing her over to whatever fate awaited her in the hands of her pursuers, but she was terrified by the implications of his defiance, by the violence that seemed inevitable now that negotiations had begun. "This is your last warning. Castillo!" the voice called again, closer now and edged with impatience. We have legal authority here. Interfering with our operation makes you an accessory to fugitive harboring. Legal authority. The words confirmed Cheryl's worst fears about the nature of their pursuers. These were not private agents or hired mercenaries. They were representatives of some official body armed with the power of law and the resources of government. Fighting them would not just be dangerous, it would be treason. But Noah seemed unmoved by the threat of legal consequences. He positioned himself at the window with the rifle ready, his movements economical and precise. Whatever authority their pursuers claimed, whatever legal justification they offered for their presence, he was prepared to meet them with force. Noah, Cheryl said, her voice barely above a whisper, you don't have to do this. I'm not worth destroying your life over. He turned to look at her, and in the firelight she saw something in his expression that took her breath away. It was not just determination or stubborn defiance. It was a kind of recognition, as if he saw in her something that resonated with his own experience. When he spoke, his words carried a weight that went far beyond their immediate situation. Everyone's worth something, he said simply. The question is whether you're willing to fight for it when the time comes. The words hung between them like a challenge, and Cheryl realized that this moment represented more than just a choice between surrender and resistance. It was a test of everything she had believed about herself, about what she was willing to sacrifice for the chance to reclaim her dignity and her life. The woman who had collapsed at his gate had been broken by circumstances beyond her control. But the woman sitting in this cabin, facing armed pursuit in the company of a man who refused to abandon her, had the opportunity to choose who she wanted to become. Outside, the voices grew more urgent, the tone shifting from official authority to barely contained threat. The men were losing patience with negotiations, preparing to move to more direct methods of achieving their objectives. Cheryl could hear them positioning themselves around the cabin, the soft sounds of boots on stone and the metallic click of weapons being readied. How many ways out of here? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Noah smiled grimly, apparently pleased by the change in her tone. 3, he said. Front door, back window, and a root cellar that connects to a tunnel I dug years ago, leads to a cave system about a quarter mile down the slope. The revelation that he had prepared escape routes suggested a level of paranoia that might have seemed excessive under normal circumstances. But given their current situation, his foresight appeared to be the difference between capture and freedom. Cheryl wondered what experiences had taught him to plan for moments like this. The tunnel, she said. Can we reach it without being seen? Maybe, Noah replied, but it means leaving everything behind. Once we go into those caves, we're committed to staying hidden until they give up the search. Could be days, could be weeks. The prospect of extended hiding in underground caves was daunting, but it seemed preferable to whatever fate awaited her in the hands of her pursuers. At least in the darkness below ground, she would have a chance to understand what forces were arrayed against her and why her grandmother's property had suddenly become so important to powerful people. A new voice joined the chorus outside, one that made Cheryl's blood run cold with recognition. Gregory Reyes, the banker who had foreclosed on her house, was directing the operation personally. His presence confirmed her worst suspicions about the nature of the conspiracy she had stumbled into. This was not just about recovering a fugitive, it was about protecting secrets that could destroy careers and fortunes. Miss Jimenez, Gregory called, his voice carrying the same apologetic tone he had used during the foreclosure proceedings. I know you're frightened and confused, but this doesn't have to end badly. We just need to talk, to clear up some misunderstandings about your grandmother's property. No one wants to hurt you. The reasonable tone was more unsettling than outright threats would have been. It suggested that Gregory still believed he could manipulate her, that she was naive enough to trust the same man who had already destroyed her life once. The condescension in his voice reminded her of every patronizing official who had dismissed her concerns and ignored her pleas for help. He's lying, Noah said quietly, though Cheryl had already reached the same conclusion. Men don't bring armed parties up mountains at night to have conversations. Whatever he wants from you, he's prepared to take by force. The truth of his assessment was confirmed by the sounds of movement around the cabin. the systematic positioning of men who were preparing for assault rather than negotiation. Gregory's words were meant to buy time, to keep them talking while his forces completed their encirclement. The pretense of peaceful resolution was just another form of manipulation. The root cellar, Cheryl said, making her decision with a finality that surprised her. Show me the way. Noah nodded approvingly and moved to a corner of the cabin where a heavy wooden chest sat against the wall. He pushed it aside with practiced ease, revealing a trap door that had been concealed beneath. The opening was dark and narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it represented their only chance of escaping the trap that was closing around them. Ladies first, Noah said, gesturing toward the opening. The tunnel slopes down for about 50 feet, then levels out. Follow it until you reach a chamber with 3 passages. Take the middle one and keep going until you see daylight. Cheryl hesitated at the edge of the opening, struck by the realization that Noah was not planning to follow her immediately. What about you? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Someone needs to slow them down, he replied, checking his rifle one final time. Give you a head start before they realize we're gone. I'll be right behind you. The lie was kindly meant but transparent. Noah was planning to make a stand, to buy her escape with his own life if necessary. The sacrifice was both noble and heartbreaking, a gesture that restored her faith in human decency even as it filled her with despair at the cost. I won't leave you, she said, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. We go together or not at all. Noah's expression softened, and for a moment she glimpsed the man behind the mountain hermit's facade, someone who had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to have someone refuse to abandon him. When he spoke, his voice carried a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the violence that surrounded them. Cheryl, he said gently, you don't understand what you're asking. These men won't stop hunting you just because I'm captured or killed. Your only chance is to disappear completely, to become someone they can't find or track. I can't do that with a bullet in my back and a price on my head. The logic was unassailable, but it did nothing to ease the anguish she felt at the thought of leaving him to face their pursuers alone. This man had shown her kindness when she had nothing to offer in return, had risked everything to protect a stranger who had brought danger to his doorstep. The idea of abandoning him now felt like a betrayal of everything decent in her soul. But even as she struggled with the moral implications of escape, the sound of splintering wood announced that their time for debate had ended. The cabin door, reinforced though it was, could not withstand the organized assault of determined men with proper tools. In moments, their sanctuary would be breached and their choices would be reduced to surrender or death. Go, Noah commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Now! Cheryl dropped through the opening into darkness that swallowed her like a living thing, her feet finding purchase on rough wooden rungs that descended into the earth beneath Noah's cabin. Above her, she could hear the crash of the door giving way, followed by shouting voices and the heavy tread of boots on wooden floors. The sounds of confrontation were muffled by the earth around her, but she could still make out Noah's voice, calm and defiant as he faced the men who had come to take her. The tunnel was exactly as he had described it, narrow and sloping downward through rock and packed earth that spoke of months or years of careful excavation. Her hands traced the walls as she moved, feeling the tool marks that told the story of a man who had prepared for this moment long before he knew it would come. The air was cold and stale, carrying the scent of deep earth and stone that reminded her how far she was from the world above. Behind her, the sounds of conflict grew more intense. She heard furniture overturning, the crash of broken glass, and voices raised in anger and confusion as the searchers discovered the empty cabin and the hidden entrance to her escape route. Gregory's voice rose above the others, sharp with frustration, as he realized that his quarry had slipped through his fingers once again. The tunnel leveled out as Noah had promised, opening into a natural cave system that stretched away into darkness beyond the reach of any light. Cheryl paused at the junction, trying to remember his instructions about which passage to follow, when she heard something that made her heart stop. A single gunshot, sharp and final, echoing down through the tunnel from the cabin above. The sound seemed to hang in the darkness around her, a punctuation mark that ended all her hopes of Noah following her into the tunnels. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes, fighting against the grief and guilt that threatened to overwhelm her. He had died protecting her, sacrificing his life for a woman he barely knew, and she would carry the weight of that sacrifice for whatever remained of her own life. But even as despair threatened to claim her, she heard Noah's voice in her memory, his words about everyone being worth something and the importance of fighting for what mattered. He had not died so that she could collapse in these tunnels and surrender to the forces that pursued her. He had died so that she could escape, so that she could survive to expose whatever conspiracy had cost them both so much. With renewed determination, she chose the middle passage and began moving deeper into the cave system. The darkness was absolute, forcing her to navigate by touch alone, her hands trailing along the rough walls as she felt her way forward, step by careful step. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes opening into larger chambers, sometimes narrowing to gaps that she had to squeeze through sideways. Time lost all meaning in the underground darkness. She might have been walking for minutes or hours, there was no way to tell. Her legs, weakened by days of hunger and exhaustion, began to tremble with the effort of navigating the treacherous terrain. More than once she stumbled over unseen obstacles, her hands and knees scraping against stone as she fought to maintain her balance. But gradually she became aware of a change in the quality of the darkness ahead. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but slowly it resolved into the faintest suggestion of gray light filtering through the blackness. She pressed forward with renewed energy, following the gradual brightening until she emerged from a narrow opening onto a ledge that overlooked a valley she did not recognize. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the darkness of the tunnels. The valley below was shrouded in morning mist, its details obscured but its general contours visible in the growing light. She had no idea how far she had traveled underground or in what direction, but she was clearly miles from Noah's cabin and the men who had been hunting her. The realization that she was free, that she had escaped the trap that had seemed certain to claim her, brought no joy. The price of her freedom had been too high, paid in the blood of a good man who had deserved better than to die protecting a stranger. She sat on the rocky ledge and allowed herself a moment of grief for Noah Castillo, the mountain hermit who had shown her what courage looked like in the face of impossible odds. But grief was a luxury she could not afford for long. Even now her pursuers might be following her trail through the tunnels, their dogs picking up her scent and leading them ever closer to her hiding place. She needed to move, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the cave entrance before they discovered her escape route. The valley below offered both opportunity and danger. Its mist-shrouded depths might provide concealment, but they also represented unknown terrain where she could easily become lost or injured. The slopes leading down were steep and treacherous, covered with loose stone that could give way beneath her feet and send her tumbling to her death. But as she studied the landscape, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken with hope. Far below, barely visible through the morning mist, she could see the thin line of a road winding through the valley floor. Where there were roads, there were people. And where there were people, there might be help. It was a slim chance, but it was the only one she had. She began her descent carefully, testing each foothold before committing her weight to it. The slope was even more treacherous than it had appeared from above, loose shale and weathered rock that shifted unpredictably beneath her feet. More than once she found herself sliding several feet before managing to arrest her fall, her hands torn and bleeding from grasping at sharp stones. The sun climbed higher as she made her way down the mountainside, burning away the concealing mist and revealing the valley in stark detail. The road she had spotted was real, a narrow dirt track that wound between stands of pine and aspen toward what looked like a small settlement in the distance. Smoke rose from several chimneys, promising warmth and possibly food for someone desperate enough to risk approaching strangers. But even as hope began to stir in her chest, she heard something that sent ice through her veins. The distant baying of hounds, carried on the morning air from somewhere high above her on the mountainside. Her pursuers had found the cave entrance and were following her trail with the same grim determination that had driven them up Eagle Peak in the first place. The race was on again, but this time she had a destination and a plan. If she could reach the settlement before the dogs caught up to her, she might find help or at least witnesses who would make it difficult for her pursuers to simply make her disappear. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation had become her constant companion over the past few days. She abandoned caution and began moving as quickly as the terrain would allow, half running and half sliding down the steep slope toward the valley floor. Behind her, the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer, a reminder that her enemies were as determined as they were well organized. The final confrontation was approaching, and everything would depend on whether she could reach safety before they reached her. The settlement materialized through the morning haze like a mirage born of desperate hope. Its handful of weathered buildings clustered around a crossroads that seemed to promise sanctuary. Cheryl's legs trembled with exhaustion as she stumbled down the final slope, her torn dress catching on brambles that left fresh scratches on skin, already marked by her harrowing descent. Behind her, the baying of the hounds grew ever closer, their relentless pursuit a reminder that freedom remained tantalizingly out of reach, despite the proximity of civilization. The first building she encountered was a general store, its painted sign faded but still legible in the strengthening daylight. Through dust-streaked windows, she could see shelves lined with goods and the shadowy figure of someone moving about inside. The sight of another human being, someone who might offer help or at least bear witness to whatever was about to unfold, filled her with a surge of desperate energy that carried her across the final yards to the wooden steps. She burst through the door with such force that it slammed against the wall, causing the elderly woman behind the counter to drop the ledger she had been examining. The woman's eyes widened as she took in Cheryl's bedraggled appearance. Her torn clothing and wild hair, the scratches and bruises that told the story of her flight through the mountains. But there was no fear in her gaze, only the kind of practical concern that came from years of dealing with travelers in distress. "My word, child," the woman said, her voice carrying the soft accent of someone who had spent her entire life in these mountains. "What on earth has happened to you?" She moved around the counter with surprising agility for someone of her advanced years, her weathered hands already reaching for a blanket that hung on a nearby peg. Cheryl tried to speak, to explain the complex web of circumstances that had brought her to this moment, but the words came out as little more than gasps and broken syllables. The combination of physical exhaustion and emotional trauma had left her barely capable of coherent speech. Instead, she gestured frantically toward the door, trying to communicate the urgency of her situation through movement alone. The woman, who introduced herself as Evelyn Reed, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation even without a detailed explanation. She wrapped the blanket around Cheryl's shoulders and guided her to a chair beside the store's pot-bellied stove, where warmth began to seep into bones that felt frozen to the marrow. "There now," Evelyn said soothingly. "You're safe here. Whatever's chasing you, we'll figure it out together." The kindness in her voice was almost more than Cheryl could bear after the violence and betrayal of the past few hours. She found herself crying, not the desperate sobs of fear and desperation that had marked her flight, but the deeper tears of someone who had forgotten what it meant to be treated with simple human decency. Through her tears, she managed to gasp out fragments of her story, enough to convey that she was being pursued by armed men who meant her harm. Evelyn listened with the patience of someone who had heard many tales of woe over the years, nodding at appropriate moments and making soft sounds of sympathy and outrage. When Cheryl mentioned the banker Gregory Reyes, the older woman's expression hardened with recognition and disgust. "That man's been trouble for years," she said grimly, "always finding ways to separate honest folk from their property through legal tricks in fine print." The sound of approaching horses cut through their conversation like a blade, accompanied by the triumphant baying of hounds that had finally caught the scent of their quarry. Evelyn moved to the window with surprising speed, peering through the glass at the riders who were thundering into the settlement with the confidence of men who believed themselves above local law. "6 of them," she reported quietly, "and they're armed for trouble." Cheryl felt her newly found sense of safety crumbling as the reality of her situation reasserted itself. These men had followed her across miles of treacherous mountain terrain, had perhaps killed Noah Castillo in their determination to capture her, and they would not be deterred by the presence of witnesses or the sanctity of a small mountain settlement. Whatever secrets she had stumbled upon were worth enough to these people that they would risk exposure and violence to protect them. There's a back room, Evelyn said urgently, already moving toward a door behind the counter. Storage area with another exit that leads to the alley. You can slip out while I delay them here. But even as the older woman spoke, the sound of boots on wooden steps announced that their time for planning had run out. The store's front door opened with a force that sent it crashing against the wall, and Gregory Reyes strode in with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and authority. He was followed by two other men, both armed and both wearing the kind of hard expressions that suggested they were prepared to use violence if necessary. Gregory's appearance was disheveled from the long night of pursuit, his usually immaculate clothing torn and stained, his face marked by scratches from mountain brambles. But his eyes burned with a determination that made Cheryl's blood run cold, the look of a man who had invested too much in this enterprise to accept failure. When his gaze fell upon her huddled form beside the stove, his lips curved in a smile that held no warmth or mercy. "Miss Jimenez," he said, his voice carrying the same false courtesy he had employed during their previous encounters. "You've led us quite a chase. I hope you understand that this has all been a terrible misunderstanding that we can resolve quickly and quietly." Evelyn stepped between them, her small frame somehow managing to project an authority that made the armed men pause. "This is private property," she said firmly, "and this young woman is under my protection. You have no right to come barging in here making threats." Gregory's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "I'm afraid you don't understand the situation, madam. Miss Jimenez is wanted in connection with the theft of important documents, and we have legal authority to apprehend her." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper that he displayed with theatrical flourish. "This warrant gives us the right to search any property and detain any person we deem necessary for our investigation." The document looked official enough, complete with seals and signatures that would impress anyone who did not examine them too closely. But Cheryl had seen enough of Gregory's methods to recognize another layer of deception, another legal fiction designed to give his actions the appearance of legitimacy. The warrant was probably as fraudulent as the foreclosure that had started this entire nightmare. "What documents?" Evelyn demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. "What could this poor child possibly have stolen that would justify sending armed men after her?" Gregory's expression flickered with annoyance at the older woman's persistence, but he maintained his facade of official authority. "Property surveys and mineral rights documentation that were removed from a foreclosed property without authorization. The theft of such documents is a serious federal crime, given their potential impact on interstate commerce and mining operations." The explanation was smooth and plausible, the kind of bureaucratic justification that could make almost any action seem reasonable and necessary. But Cheryl remembered the document that she had found in her grandmother's attic, the old surveys and property deeds that had seemed like historical curiosities at the time. If Gregory was willing to organize armed pursuit and risk violence to recover them, they must have contained information far more valuable than she had realized. "I don't have any documents," she said, finding her voice at last despite the fear that threatened to choke her words. "Everything was lost when the bank foreclosed on my house. If there were papers there, you would have found them when you took possession of the property." Gregory's smile became predatory, revealing the calculation behind his false courtesy. "Oh, but we did find them, Miss Jimenez. The question is what you might have learned from examining them before they came into our possession. Certain information, if it became public knowledge, could cause considerable embarrassment to various parties involved in legitimate business transactions." The admission confirmed Cheryl's growing understanding of the conspiracy she had unwittingly stumbled into. The documents had contained proof of something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden, evidence that could expose fraud or corruption on a scale that made her own financial ruin seem insignificant by comparison. She was being hunted not for what she had stolen, but for what she might have learned. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she processed the implications of Gregory's words. "So you're not here to recover stolen property," she said with growing anger. "You're here to silence a witness to your own crimes. This isn't law enforcement. It's a cover-up." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon, stripping away the last pretense of legitimacy from Gregory's actions. His mask of official authority slipped, revealing the desperate criminal beneath. A man who had overextended himself in pursuit of wealth and power and now faced exposure and ruin if his secrets became known. Enough, he said sharply, gesturing to his companions. Take her, and deal with the old woman if she interferes. The command galvanized everyone in the room into action. Cheryl sprang from her chair, the blanket falling away as she darted toward the back room that Evelyn had indicated. Behind her, she heard the older woman's voice raised in defiant protest, followed by the sound of a struggle as the men moved to subdue her. The knowledge that her presence had brought violence to someone who had shown her nothing but kindness added another layer of guilt to the weight she already carried. The storage room was cramped and cluttered, filled with boxes and barrels that created a maze of obstacles between her and the rear exit. She navigated the narrow passages between the stored goods with desperate haste, her hands searching frantically for the door handle that would lead to freedom. Behind her, heavy footsteps announced that her pursuers had followed her into the confined space, their larger frames making them clumsy as they tried to maneuver between the obstacles. She found the door just as rough hands grabbed her shoulders, spinning her around to face one of Gregory's hired men. He was a hard-faced individual with the kind of scars that spoke of a violent profession, and his grip on her arms was strong enough to leave bruises. But desperation had given her a strength she had not known she possessed, and she fought back with a ferocity that surprised them both. Her knee connected with his groin, doubling him over with a grunt of pain that gave her the opening she needed to wrench free of his grasp. She fumbled with the door latch, her fingers slippery with sweat and trembling with adrenaline, while behind her the man recovered from her attack and lunged forward with murderous intent. The door opened just as his hands closed on her dress, and she threw herself through the opening with such force that the fabric tore, leaving him holding empty cloth as she tumbled into the alley beyond. The narrow space between buildings was filled with the detritus of small-town life, discarded crates and barrels that provided both obstacles and potential weapons. Cheryl grabbed a broken piece of wood from a pile of refuse and wielded it like a club as her pursuer emerged from the storage room, his face twisted with rage and frustration. The improvised weapon was hardly adequate against a trained killer, but it was better than facing him empty-handed. The confrontation was brief and brutal, a desperate struggle between a man accustomed to violence and a woman fighting for her very survival. Cheryl's makeshift club connected with his temple with a solid thunk that sent him staggering backward, blood streaming from the wound. But the blow was not enough to disable him completely, and he recovered quickly, his hand moving toward the gun holstered at his hip. The sight of the weapon being drawn galvanized Cheryl into action once more. She turned and ran toward the mouth of the alley, where the main street promised witnesses and potential help. But even as she ran, she could hear Gregory's voice from inside the store, raised in anger as he berated his remaining men for allowing her to escape. The pursuit would resume within moments, and she had nowhere left to run. It was then that she heard a sound that made her heart leap with impossible hope. The distinctive crack of a rifle, fired from somewhere high above the settlement, followed by a cry of pain and surprise from one of her pursuers. She looked up toward the surrounding hills and saw a figure silhouetted against the morning sky. A man with a rifle who was taking careful aim at the men who had been hunting her. Noah Castillo stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the settlement, very much alive despite the gunshots she had heard in the tunnels. His appearance was that of a man who had been through hell, his clothes torn and bloodied, his face marked by cuts and bruises. But his hands were steady as he worked the bulb of his rifle, and his eyes burned with the cold fury of someone who had been pushed beyond his limits. "That's far enough, Reyes," his voice carried clearly across the distance, amplified by the natural acoustics of the mountain valley. "Call off your dogs and ride out of here, or I'll start dropping them where they stand." Gregory emerged from the store with his remaining men, their faces upturned toward the sniper's position with expressions of shock and calculation. The banker's carefully laid plans were unraveling before his eyes, his hired killers suddenly vulnerable to a marksman who commanded the high ground and had already demonstrated his willingness to use lethal force. "You're interfering with a lawful arrest, Castillo," Gregory called out, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining his facade of authority. "This woman is a federal fugitive, and you're making yourself an accessory to her crimes. Noah's response was to work the bolt of his rifle again, the metallic sound echoing off the surrounding buildings like a death knell. The only crime I see here is armed men terrorizing innocent people, he replied. You've got 30 seconds to mount up and ride out, or I start making this personal. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, each side calculating odds and considering options in the space of heartbeats. Gregory's men were professionals, but they were also pragmatists who understood that their employer's money was worthless if they were dead. Being caught in the open by a skilled marksman with the advantage of elevation and cover was not a situation that any of them wanted to prolong. But Gregory himself seemed driven by something beyond rational calculation, a desperation that made him willing to risk everything rather than accept defeat. You don't understand what's at stake here, Castillo, he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. That woman has information that could destroy legitimate business interests, cost hundreds of people their jobs. This is bigger than one person's life. The revelation confirmed what Cheryl had begun to suspect about the true scope of the conspiracy she had uncovered. Her grandmother's property documents had apparently exposed something vast and corrupt, a web of fraud and deception that reached far beyond a simple foreclosure scheme. The stakes were high enough that powerful people were willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. Noah's response was swift and decisive. His rifle cracked again, and one of Gregory's men cried out as the bullet shattered the wooden post inches from his head. The message was clear. The mountain man was done with talking and ready to start killing if his demands were not met immediately. The demonstration of marksmanship had the desired effect on Gregory's hired guns. They began backing toward their horses with the careful movements of men who understood that they were in the crosshairs of someone who could kill them at will. Their employer might be willing to die for his cause, but they had no intention of joining him in martyrdom for the sake of a paycheck. This isn't over, Gregory called out as he reluctantly followed his men toward their mounts. You can't hide her forever, Castillo. There are forces at work here that are bigger than both of you, and they won't stop until they get what they want. The threat carried weight despite the banker's current disadvantage. Even if this particular pursuit had been thwarted, the interests he represented had resources and reach that could make life difficult for anyone who opposed them. Cheryl realized that her ordeal was far from over, that she would be looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life unless she found a way to expose the truth behind her persecution. But for now, she was safe, protected by a man who had risked everything to ensure her survival. As Gregory and his men mounted their horses and rode out of the settlement, she felt a complex mixture of relief and gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her composure. Noah had not only survived their earlier confrontation, but had somehow tracked her pursuers to this remote valley and arrived at the crucial moment to save her life. Evelyn emerged from the store, her gray hair disheveled, but her spirit unbroken by her encounter with Gregory's men. She moved to Cheryl's side with the protective instincts of a mother hen, wrapping the younger woman in another blanket while keeping a wary eye on the departing riders. Are you hurt, child? She asked, her hands checking for injuries with practiced efficiency. Cheryl shook her head, though she was beginning to feel the accumulated damage of her ordeal. Her body was covered with cuts and bruises, her muscles ached from the physical strain of her flight, and her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. But she was alive, and for the moment that seemed like miracle enough. Noah made his way down from his elevated position with the careful movements of someone who had been injured but was determined not to show weakness. As he drew closer, Cheryl could see that his condition was worse than she had initially realized. His shirt was torn and bloodstained, his face was pale with blood loss, and he favored his left side in a way that suggested broken ribs or internal injuries. You're hurt, she said, moving toward him with concern that overrode her own exhaustion. You need medical attention. Noah waved off her worry with characteristic stoicism, though she could see the pain he was trying to hide. I'll live, he said simply. The question is what we do next. Gregory wasn't bluffing about having powerful friends, and they won't give up just because we won this round. The practical reality of their situation was sobering. They had gained a temporary reprieve, but their enemies had resources and determination that would make them formidable opponents in any prolonged conflict. Cheryl needed to find a way to expose the truth behind the conspiracy that had destroyed her life. But doing so would require evidence and allies that seemed impossibly out of reach. It was Evelyn who provided the first glimmer of hope for a solution to their dilemma. "There's someone you need to meet," she said, her weathered face thoughtful as she considered their options. "Emma James over in Millfield. She's a journalist, one of those crusading types who specializes in exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable. If anyone can help you get your story out, it would be her." The suggestion offered a path forward that had not occurred to Cheryl in her desperation to simply survive from one moment to the next. If she could document her experiences and provide evidence of the conspiracy against her, she might be able to turn her persecution into a weapon against her persecutors. The idea of fighting back, of taking control of her own destiny instead of simply reacting to the actions of others, filled her with a sense of purpose that she had not felt since her ordeal began. But Noah's expression remained skeptical as he considered the proposal. "Journalists can be bought or intimidated just like anyone else," he pointed out. "And going public means making yourself a permanent target. These people have already shown they're willing to kill to protect their secrets." The warning was valid, but Cheryl found that she was no longer content to spend her life hiding from shadows and running from threats she did not fully understand. The woman who had collapsed at Noah's gate had been broken by circumstances beyond her control, but the woman who stood in this mountain settlement had been forged by adversity into something stronger and more determined. "I can't live in fear forever," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "If I don't fight back, if I don't try to expose the truth, then they win, and Noah dies for nothing, and you get hurt for nothing, and other people suffer the same way I have." Noah studied her face for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of respect and that had not been there before. "You've changed," he observed. "The woman I found at my gate wouldn't have talked about fighting back." The observation was accurate, and it made Cheryl realize how much she had been transformed by her ordeal. The comfortable certainties of her former life had been stripped away, leaving her with a clearer understanding of what truly mattered and what she was willing to sacrifice to protect it. She was no longer the naive schoolteacher who had trusted in the basic fairness of the world. She was someone who understood that justice sometimes had to be fought for against overwhelming odds. "Then it's settled," Evelyn said, with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "We'll get you both to Millfield to meet with Emma James. But first, we need to tend to your injuries and make sure you are strong enough for the journey ahead." The older woman's practical concern was a reminder that their immediate survival still depended on basic necessities like food, shelter, and medical care. The grand plans for exposing corruption and seeking justice would have to wait until they had addressed the more pressing needs of wounded bodies and exhausted spirits. As they made their way back into the store, Cheryl caught Noah's arm and pulled him aside for a moment of private conversation. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying all the gratitude and emotion that she could not adequately express. "For everything. For saving my life. For believing in me. For showing me what courage looks like." Noah's response was characteristically understated, but she could see the depth of feeling in his dark eyes. "You saved yourself," he said quietly. "I just provided a little covering fire when you needed it most." The journey to Millfield took 3 days, traveling by back roads and mountain paths that avoided the main thoroughfares where Gregory's allies might be watching for them. Noah's injuries made the trip difficult for him, but he bore the discomfort with the stoic endurance that seemed to be his defining characteristic. Cheryl found herself taking on the role of caretaker, tending to his wounds and ensuring that he got the rest he needed despite his protests that he was fine. The time they spent together on the trail allowed for conversations that had been impossible during the crisis of their initial meeting. She learned that Noah had indeed been a soldier, a veteran of conflicts that he preferred not to discuss in detail. His retreat to the mountains had been motivated not by misanthropy, but by a need to find peace after witnessing too much violence and suffering. The irony that her arrival had brought more violence into his carefully constructed sanctuary was not lost on either of them. For her part, Cheryl found herself sharing stories of her grandmother, the woman who had raised her and instilled in her the values that had sustained her through her recent ordeal. The old woman had been a teacher herself, someone who believed in the power of education and truth to overcome ignorance and injustice. It seemed fitting that her granddaughter would honor her memory by fighting to expose the corruption that had cost them both so much. Emma James proved to be everything that Evelyn had promised and more. A woman in her 40s with graying hair and sharp intelligence, she listened to Cheryl's story with the focused attention of someone who understood the significance of what she was hearing. Her questions were probing but sympathetic, designed to elicit details that would be crucial for building a case against the conspirators. "The documents you found in your grandmother's attic," Emma said, her pen poised over a notebook filled with careful observations. "Can you describe them in detail? Any specifics about dates, names, or property boundaries could be crucial for corroborating your account." Cheryl closed her eyes and tried to recall the papers that had seemed so unimportant at the time, but had apparently set in motion the events that had nearly cost her life. "There were survey maps dating back to the 1870s, she said slowly, showing mineral rights and water access that extended much further than what the bank claimed when they foreclosed. And there were correspondence files, letters between my grandmother and various mining companies about lease agreements that were supposedly never finalized." Emma's eyes sharpened with interest as she scribbled notes. "Mineral rights disputes are exactly the kind of thing that could motivate the level of conspiracy you've described. If your grandmother's property contained valuable deposits that were being illegally extracted by companies with connections to Gregory Reyes, the financial stakes would be enormous." The journalist's analysis provided a framework for understanding the forces that had been arrayed against Cheryl from the moment she had discovered those old papers. Her grandmother's land had apparently been worth far more than anyone had realized, and powerful interests had conspired to steal it through fraudulent foreclosure proceedings. Cheryl's potential knowledge of the truth had made her a threat that needed to be eliminated. "What we need now is corroborating evidence," Emma continued, her mind already working on the investigative strategies that would be required to expose the conspiracy. "Official records, witness testimony, financial documents that show the connections between the various parties involved. It won't be easy and it won't be safe, but it's the only way to ensure that justice is served." The prospect of a long and dangerous investigation was daunting, but Cheryl found that she was no longer intimidated by the challenges ahead. The woman who had once been paralyzed by the loss of her security and status had been replaced by someone who understood that real security could only come from fighting for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Noah, who had been listening to their conversation with his characteristic quiet intensity, finally spoke up with a practical observation. "They'll be watching for any signs that Cheryl is working with journalists or investigators. The moment this story starts to come together, they'll escalate their efforts to silence her permanently." Emma nodded grimly, acknowledging the validity of his concern. "That's why we need to work quickly and carefully, building an airtight case before they realize what we're doing. And it's why Cheryl will need to remain hidden until we're ready to go public with our findings." The plan that emerged from their discussions was ambitious and risky, requiring careful coordination between multiple parties and absolute secrecy until the moment of revelation. Emma would use her contacts and resources to investigate the financial and legal aspects of the conspiracy, while Noah would provide security and ensure that Cheryl remained safe during the months of preparation that would be required. As they finalized their strategy, Cheryl felt a sense of purpose and determination that had been absent from her life since her grandmother's death. She was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but an active participant in the fight for justice. The transformation was both liberating and terrifying, opening up possibilities she had never imagined, while also exposing her to dangers she was only beginning to understand. The work ahead would be difficult and dangerous, requiring her to confront powerful enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence to protect their interests. But she was no longer the frightened, desperate woman who had collapsed at Noah's gate. She had been forged by adversity into someone capable of standing up to those who had wronged her, and she was determined to see justice done regardless of the personal cost. 6 months later, the story broke across newspapers throughout the region like a thunderclap, exposing a web of corruption that reached from small-town banks to state government offices. Gregory Reyes was arrested on charges of fraud and conspiracy, along with a dozen co-conspirators who had participated in the illegal seizure of mineral-rich properties throughout the mountain valleys. The evidence that Emma had painstakingly assembled was overwhelming, painting a picture of systematic theft that had cost hundreds of families their homes and livelihoods. Cheryl's testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, her first-hand account of the conspiracy providing the human element that made the complex financial crimes understandable to juries and the general public. The woman who had once been too intimidated to challenge a bank foreclosure had become a powerful advocate for justice, her courage inspiring others to come forward with their own stories of victimization. The legal victories were satisfying, but the personal transformation was even more significant. Cheryl had discovered reserves of strength and determination that she had never known she possessed, qualities that had been forged in the crucible of adversity and tempered by the support of people who believed in her cause. She was no longer defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she had chosen to fight for. Noah remained a constant presence throughout the long months of investigation and trial, his quiet strength providing an anchor in the storms of publicity and legal proceedings. Their relationship had evolved from rescuer and victim to something deeper and more complex, built on shared hardship and mutual respect. They had both been changed by their ordeal, and they had found in each other the kind of partnership that could weather any storm. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after Cheryl had first collapsed at his mountain gate, they stood together on the porch of a small cabin that Noah had built in a hidden valley far from the scenes of their earlier trials. The structure was simple but solid, constructed with the same careful attention to detail that characterized everything the mountain man undertook. It was a home in the truest sense of the word, a place where two people who had found each other in the darkness could build a future together. "Do you ever regret it?" Cheryl asked, watching the sun rise over the peaks that had once seemed like barriers, but now felt like guardians. "Giving up your solitude, getting involved in all the complications that came with helping me?" Noah considered the question with the thoughtful deliberation that she had come to love about him. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I spent years thinking that isolation was the same thing as peace," he said quietly. "But real peace isn't about avoiding conflict or hiding from the world's problems. It's about finding something worth fighting for, and someone worth fighting alongside." The simple truth of his observations settled over them like the morning light, illuminating not just the landscape around them, but the path they had traveled together. They had both been broken by their past experiences, but they had found in each other the strength to rebuild themselves into something better and stronger than they had been before. As they stood together watching the dawn break over their mountain sanctuary, Cheryl reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything she thought she valued, only to discover that the things she had truly needed had been waiting for her all along. The woman who had once measured her worth by her possessions and social status had learned that real wealth lay in courage, integrity, and the love of someone who saw her true value, even when she could not see it herself. The future stretched ahead of them like an uncharted trail, full of unknown challenges and unexpected opportunities. But they would face whatever came together, two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of their former lives. And in the end, that was worth more than all the gold that might lie hidden in these ancient mountains.